Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 2 by Darren, Judge, Andrea, and Korinne facilitating it. I just wanted to let you know that I really enjoyed your discussion. You all showed the evidence of reading and preparation and merging different materials in your discussion. And so I really enjoyed your interactions as well, and Korinne did a fantastic job on moving the information forward and making sure that it was progressing, but you did an excellent job on the coverage of the topics for that particular week. So just to remind you, since it's been a while, that was the part on evacuations and police in evacuations, pets in evacuations, and different regulatory mandatory evacuations, and so on and so forth. So you started a discussion, and I think it was Darren that talked about reasons why people do not evacuate in emergencies and crises, and you discussed those issues of lower socioeconomic status, access to vehicles, fears about sheltering, public fears about shelters, past history with disasters, so really bad experiences, for example, in shelters, or the fact that people are not imagining that the event, or not believing that the event was going to be of a magnitude that was reported by the officials. Judge, I think, brought very early on a conversation on fears, public fears on looting, which are perpetuated in the media, but they're pretty much non-existent in research and literature on the topic. And I think that's very important to, in any type of public awareness campaigns, or, having a responsible role for the media, to be very cognizant of that. Several studies have confirmed that crime rates drop during critical incidents like Oklahoma City bombing. After Oklahoma City bombing, there were several studies that talked about crimes rates dropping. And certainly Darren, I think, later had a discussion that even though, the media's focus on that sign, you loot, we should, and it's a very bellicose stance of the communities, that one sign that gets played on the media over and over again, where in reality, people in those communities are very pro-social. And I actually had the experience with a community response to a in the recovery phase, to a family that was returning, whose family member was breaking into homes during Harvey to get medications. And that person was already then in jail in Montgomery County. But when the family came to mitigate the home, the constables actually came in with guns drawn into that house. And it prevented all the spontaneous volunteers from going there. They said, oh, that family has a looter and we're not going to go there. But most of the residents in that community were saying, they're coming to their home to mitigate it. It's really critical that they do it quick, and it's such a shame that their family member, they can't be responsible for their behavior and stuff like that. So certainly communities don't seem to be as alarmed about those instances that are few and far between as our official responders might be, or as the those things are hyped in the media. But certainly this is a reason why in a moment of stress, where your home is going to be the largest investment in your life, losing your home, it has been documented in research, is the cause of the biggest anxiety to a person. So losing a home, divorce, and death in a family are three factors that cause the biggest stress to individuals. So when you have to leave the home with a prospect you might be losing it, that's certainly a really, really huge stress. If you are worried that somebody is going to be rummaging through your possessions, or having the opportunistic access to your things that are dear to you, then certainly that will impact the decisions on evacuation. So and I think we need to have that discussion, for the reason being is because we need to reinforce in crisis communications and risk communications that the instances of looting are typically rare, and that there is a law enforcement presence, that there are roving patrols, that there are community watches that are going to be instituted before people can return to their homes, and that really needs to be reinforced to help people make the decision that is less based on irrational fear and low probability in their assessment of risk. Andrea talked in evacuations about social influence, and certainly the issues of shelter, transportation, and planning like pamphlets for about the shelters, about evacuation routes, having plans for pets, because again, that's a huge issue in disasters. The Fluffy is not going, I'm not going. And a lot of families have multiple pets, and some of the pets have health issues, and just like family members, you discuss that. So pet is a very critical element of a decision whether to evacuate or not. So the assessment of whether the shelter will allow pets, or whether the shelter will have alternative plans for fostering pets somewhere else. If a shelter, for instance, has laws related to allergies or any other issues, public health issues, and they cannot shelter pets, then they might have alternative arrangements. So, I think that's a really good discussion. Again, I think that you talked about Darren. Darren brought back those fears of looting to his practice as a professional, that he did not witness specifically looting happening in communities. Andrea talked about risk information and subsidizing of transportation to encourage evacuations, particularly for those people with low mobility issues, the disabled, and subsidizing of public transportation is a huge factor in successful evacuations. I will tell you that I have a visitor from Poland. We have a visiting scholar from Poland who does research on human trafficking, and he's staying in Huntsville. And he was at the John Jay University last month and is spending a month in Huntsville and staying in a hotel across I-45. And he doesn't have a vehicle, and he is not going to rent one because of the financial reasons. And he was absolutely bewildered about the absolute lack of public transportation in Huntsville. And he actually has to illegally cross the I-45, which, we told him to go up one exit where he can actually cross, in order to walk to campus. And then, it takes about half an hour from that hotel to get to campus. And there's no, there's no buses, there's nothing. And so his the entire 2 weeks he's been here, he's wondering how poor people and people that don't have cars function, because it's even difficult to go get groceries because, there is no grocery store right next to that motel. It's difficult to go to the bank to get money out of the ATM because his card wasn't working, so he had to walk. The infrastructure is far away from those areas. And so we've had those discussions on, and that's just Huntsville, but we've got to realize that there are socioeconomic factors that will affect people access to transportation. And the way we've built cities in the United States, some cities, certainly there is a general lack of public transportation in certain areas. So that's a huge factor. So you really had you teased out those issues of having a forethought on subsidized transportation for those areas, thinking about pets, attenuating the fears of looting, having public information campaigns in form of pamphlets. I very rarely see any pamphlets in any area that talk about, we have a shelter in Montgomery County, and very few people go to it, very few people went to it during Harvey. And the main reason is it's not very visible in a community. It's not very much advertised. It's not, you don't have pictures how it looks inside. It doesn't talk about, if pets are allowed or not. So we could certainly do much better on public campaigns. And even, if we have a hurricane season, places like Home Depot or big department stores or something, having flyers there, because that's where people go every day, get their stuff, get their plants, get their brooms and things like that. I would assume that most people go to Home Depot or places like that, Walmart, and having those things more visible is certainly would be a good strategy if you want to encourage shelters. And then of course there for obvious reasons, people do not want to go to shelters if they have other options. Your discussions then moved to recommended versus mandatory evacuation and most successful strategies. And you mentioned, I think that was Darren as well, that about 10 to 25% of mandatory evacuations are ignored. And you talked about inconsistency in nomenclature. What does it mean, a mandatory evacuation, how it is announced, how it differs from recommended, what is a recommended evacuation. And I think those are really very relevant issues to discuss. Mandatory evacuations cannot be enforced by law enforcement. And you have that discussion. Who enforces the mandatory evacuations? First of all, police officers, as you read in the article on different styles of policing in different phases of the crisis, in that particular response or acute phase, it is a watchman position, right? A watchman is certainly not somebody that puts cuffs on a person and forces them to leave their home. That's certainly not the job of local law enforcement. They have no authority to do so. So mandatory evacuations, for the most part, you mentioned New Hampshire being an exception, for the most part don't have teeth. And then even if you can enforce it, typically in a crisis phase, there is no time or resource to be actually implementing, forced mandatory evacuations. So the question is, are they effective? And I think, as a group, you have decided that looking at how different nomenclature works in different states, looking at the statistics, who heeds mandatory evacuations, and looking how general they are and kind of like a Homeland Security advisory system for terrorism that we discussed earlier this semester. What does it mean for a particular area, for a particular resident, that they have to evacuate? Very rarely those messages are very targeted for a specific zip code or specific street. They are very, very large blanket, kind of like Homeland Security advisory system. So mandatory evacuations are very challenging. People don't heed them. People don't trust public officials a lot of times. In those instances, law enforcement would not want. Darren, you would probably agree with me, you do not want to put cuffs on people that don't want to leave their homes, not in the United States. In certain countries where the military is in charge of civil protection and the military can engage in people's evacuations, not in the United States, but in other countries, they certainly have a lot more of the enforcement role or authority to enforce it, but not in the United States. So it's a big issue, for having this notion that if we issue mandatory evacuations, we're solving the evacuation problem. Certainly is a challenge. I think, Judge, you talked about evacuations during the chemical events, and you raised the issue as well that they cannot be enforced. And actually, in a chemical events, there has to be a decision made whether evacuations are actually the best option, right? You mentioned somewhere in your discussion vertical evacuations, but there is also sheltering in place, and how sheltering in place sometimes might be a lot more effective than evacuating large parts of areas with a very specific risk assessment conducted for that area. And sometimes those risk assessments are hard to do, like in Harvey, when you have disasters of that magnitude, you can't really exactly pinpoint where it might happen. Even though in Galveston during Ike, there was a very well-developed evacuation plan by zip codes and staggered plans. So which zip codes would evacuate 72 hours prior, which zip code needed to evacuate 48 hours prior, and which zip codes did not have to evacuate but could be on caution. So there was a little bit more targeted strategy. It was related to counterflow and making it work during Ike, because counterflow was supposed to be introduced. It was actually not needed in the end, but there were processes to implement it if it was needed. But those zip codes and evacuation zip codes actually really worked in Ike. Harvey did not have mandatory evacuations, or no evacuation orders were issued prior to Harvey. So in Harvey, that was not, there was certainly no, we can say there was no issue of mandatory evacuations because there was no evacuation ordered. And that, whether it was a good decision or bad decision, that's, for the research and after action reports to reveal. Most successful strategies, who disseminates the information, have those credible sources, familiar faces. I think you might have mentioned Good Morning America somewhere, your trusted news, local news, who would convey this information, but you listed also the knock on the door and the presence of your local community official that might be familiar has been cited as the most successful strategy. And certainly the knock on the door is going to depend on the amount of social capital. And what I mean by social capital, there's quite a lot of research on communities' levels of the strong social networks and belonging and so on and so forth. And in social capital, there are 3 levels. One is so-called bonding. Bonding is when people know their neighbors. Maybe they have a family living within blocks of one another. They have friends. And so they will circulate the information about the event among themselves, and they will trust those sources. So they bond, and they have a certain level of social capital. Of course, if you don't know your neighbor, if you're living in isolation, if you don't have friends in the community, then you are at a much lower level of social capital. But bonding is not enough. And the second level of social capital is what's called bridging. Bridging is where you not only know your neighbors and have friends in a community, but you also are very aware of different cultural, linguistic, social, economic status groups. You know where they are, at least. So if you know that there's elderly living in certain part of your community, if you know that there's somebody that cannot come to the door because they are disabled, if you know that there are, some people that have, oxygen tanks, obesity, whatever kind of health issues, and you're aware where they are in your community, and you have some sort of, maybe community center, you have community groups, you are more involved in sort of knowing who is where. That's called bridging. You can bridge to that community. The knock on the door is going to be, again, you have that second layer of social capital. So those people from those communities knowing that they need to go somewhere else, not just to their neighbor and not just to their friend. But bridging is not the ultimate. The ultimate strong level of social capital is when you have linking. And linking is if you have experts in your community who are gatekeepers. They know somebody from the local emergency operations center. They know a process by FEMA to get reimbursed or to set up something. They know who the veterinary is in the area. They know who does what, and they can link the community to those resources. Those are those linking pins. Those external linking resources are going to be in communities that have some kind of activities together, that maybe they have the community improvement center, homeowners association, boards, committees, after hour things for kids, chamber of commerce that's very involved within the community, church groups, things like that. So when you have bonding, bridging, and then you also have linking, that social capital is very strong. People are familiar with those areas, with the people where you need to knock, who you need to warn, what elderly, who you need to reaffirm that they are making the right decision, and who you trust, the community leaders that you trust. The problem with that ideal social capital through bonding, bridging, and linking is that our communities are not ideal nowadays. We work in distant places. We have communities at work. We have communities that are virtual. We a lot of times don't know our community because we are busy, because we are displacing ourselves during a day. So as we are rethinking, and because of architectural design, because you don't have that grocery store on the corner or that coffee place where a lot of people meet, because of the way we built. So that is also a factor. But, I digress, but the knock on the door is effective. It's going to be more prevalent in communities that have very strong social capital. Other communities are going to be left to public messages, that is through the local media and things like that. Then you move to question number 3 on behaviors, people's behaviors in disasters, and how law enforcement needs to adapt its policing strategies based on different phases of the event. And you had a really, really good discussion around this. I think Andrea or Judge might have talked about it, how law enforcement almost have to reinvent themselves in those situations, because those are those dramatic times where people lived in a home their entire life and now they have to leave. So you need to proceed with caution, so to speak, and that watchman style during a response or during the acute phase, and the service-oriented style is, you need to shift your perception of your mission of maintaining law and order to more of that of, instead of asking somebody, what are you doing here? Saying, how can I help you here? And maybe certain infractions and certain things that happen in a community, the police officers have to ignore and sort of leave it for later, and because they will be challenged by those behaviors. And, when police are challenged, and Darren, you probably would agree with me, when police are challenged, then they are hypervigilant and they become more, it's harder to, to be friendly when you have somebody resisting, which typically, you want compliance, you want obedience when you enforce law and order every day. But then in disasters, there's this other factor. People have true effects on their feelings, on their emotions, how they control their emotional intelligence, so to speak. And so law enforcement has to adjust to that. So you discussed that pre-event, reliable information, legalistic type of policing. So certainly, knock on the door, telling the people, telling them how it is, or not letting them come back. Evacuation by default. You can't go back to this house right now. It's already flooded. You need to. I'm really sorry. This is not the time for negotiation or in those situations. 2. A watchman style during the during the response or acute phase and the community service style, community policing and recovery to help people to get back to their lives, to have a sense of peace, to letting them know that you care, that they are not alone. After all, peace officers are part of that community. They are, and you know, when you think about the mission of policing, is you do what the community wants to do. You know, the community wants you to put, you know, more traffic tickets at certain intersections, or the community wants you to do more of a tourist policing, or the community wants you to do the hot spotting in areas of increased criminal activity. This is maintaining law and order is based on social expectations of that community. So similarly, you know, one would expect that the law enforcement would adjust in crisis to that community, policing to their community as well. How does it happen? There's very little research on that. So, you know, certainly leadership in policing organizations is really critical. Having briefings before those officers go on patrol, before they deal with the public, you know, de-escalation techniques, for difficult and challenging and frustrated individual in crisis. And a lot of that already is taking place. You know, police officers get a lot of training on people with special needs or mental health issues. And so, you know, it's just another strategy to look at on, you know, policing in emergency management and in crisis. Very, very interesting area of study. Not a whole lot of research, as I said, done on that. So you're thinking about capstones, you know, that's certainly really interesting situational leadership for police officers. I think you have moved to subculture discussion after that. Andrea mentioned the use of multi-agency warning systems, and you talked about the subcultures evolving around certain geographic areas that dealt with certain hazards based on frequency, you know, historical record. They have adaptations to that particular situation, and they develop their own coping mechanisms. So good emergency management would be cognizant of that. I think that Judge mentioned something about the influence of public officials in evacuations. I'm not sure if you're still talking about subcultures here, but you talked about the different ways of evacuating based by Dravik in that section as well. You talked about the evacuation by default. Certainly not a really good strategy for evacuations. You discussed the evacuation by conscious decision. Evacuation by decision is the one, as you discussed. I think Judge and Andrea, you know, had a very good discussion here on somebody who is really capable of making a risk assessment. You know, those, you know, evacuations by decisions typically involve a lot more analysis, having access to more facts, being a little bit better informed than, you know, by default, certainly. Of course, you discussed about evacuations by invitation being the most prominent, that people tend to evacuate by invitation. So some good strategies being, you know, families reaching out, and it alleviates the concern about mandatory evacuations. It decreases the anxiety. You talked about American Red Cross versus NRG, so familiarity with, you know, Red Cross being more recognized as a sheltering. I would probably have a discussion on that begs to differ with American Red Cross and Harvey and their shelters, particularly the shelters that were the last resort shelters that were open, you know, in September, Greenspoint Mall area, where, you know, you would understand why the statistics on people going to shelters are the way they are because of the way that enterprise was run. But family and friends certainly is preferred because it's that comfort of familiarity over shelters. And Andrea again talked about how, you know, the whole family gets together and social influence, and how, you know, you don't know what's in those shelters, if they allow pets, if they, you know, what kind of people are there. It's this never level of anxiety. So the pathways, the most successful pathways are, you know, the decision. That's people who have more facts, that have resources, that can assess whether they can afford driving that many miles, or, you know, pay for the hotel that maybe is remote, versus invitation to where it's more of a social influence and a lot more social support as well, versus, you know, official sheltering. Of course, some other issues. A very good discussion on social influence was by Andrea, and talking about different cultural expectations. You talked about your extended families loading up into vehicles, and it's much easier to do it when everybody else is doing it, and you support one another, and you pool resources together. So even in areas with low socioeconomic status, you might have a very strong social bonding and bridging, and strong social capital. So resources, not always about resources. It's social influence is really, really critical, and how tight certain groups are, and that should be supported by, or, you know, there should be awareness about those in emergency management. Darren talked about, you know, again, that trust and what the people are saying versus what the media are saying, if there is an alignment there, particularly social media. You know, you talked about social media. Social media is becoming a huge factor in people's decisions in disasters. And it's one of those, I think, linking factors, where now, you know, even if in your community, if you don't have that linking pin to the resources, you can get it from the Facebook or Twitter. And we've seen that in Harvey, certainly, and from crowdsourcing. So that's becoming a really huge area of study on the influence of social media on decisions in disasters. Okay, then you moved on to vertical evacuations, and talked about, you know, making sure that, you know, the difference that, you know, there might be some hazards like tornadoes that will require actually vertical evacuations down, or that was, I think there was Korinne that mentioned that. And also sometimes evacuations are not the best plan of action. And you discussed the largest chemical incident in the Harris County history that happened recently, and sheltering in place is more recommended. Vertical evacuations sort of became decried in Katrina, because for residential areas, particularly for one-floor homes, you know, in certain type of hazards, they're not very effective, but they can be extremely effective for institutions such as hospitals, such as jails. And Harris County Jail, case in point, I had discussions with the deputy assistant to the sheriff, Deborah Schmidt, who during Harvey was considering vertical evacuation. Their lower floors had medical equipment and medical facilities, dialysis, things like that. And but there was also on one of the lower floors, those the most violent offenders. And then there were, you know, discussions and how are you going to move people up? Are you going to move the violent offenders? Are you going to leave them? I mean, a lot of ethical decisions there. And so, but certainly the evacuation of a jail outside was not an option. The same, one of the hospitals that I personally know of did vertical evacuation during Harvey because they were an island in the storm, and so they could not evacuate outside. So they had to think about vertical. So again, sometimes evacuation in a mandatory area evacuation could be a peril for the institution, and might be better to stay in place. If, of course, the infrastructure is sound, if there is no, you know, if you've got tons of glass in a tornado, you know, then, you know, that might not be really good. So really good on that. You did a really good job on taking turns. I had a note in my notes here as well. As far as talking about other strategies for ensuring successful evacuations, you talked about interstate coordination. I think that's huge. For example, how do you reconcile the fact that you go from 6 lanes in Harris County to towards Walker County, that Interstate 45 changes into 2 lanes, and how do you plan for that throughput of traffic? Again, low mobility cases, places like elderly care, home evacuations. There's this really tragic event during Ike where the whole bus with evacuees from the elderly home caught on fire, and there's a lot of people died in that during transit. Again, some of those places like assisted care living facilities, they do not typically do a lot of planning. During Ike in Montgomery County, where I am, I was in South Montgomery County Emergency Operations Center, and we had requests from the local support elderly home community. They had no air in their oxygen tanks. They had no ice or no refrigeration for their medications, and they had 4 hot dogs left for the residents in that community. 2 days after Ike hit. So those integration of those type of facilities into transportation planning, for people with mobility needs is really critical. Okay, you talked about issues of transportation in Hurricane Harvey, and Hurricane Harvey was a transportation event because typically, and Darren, you discussed how there were evacuation by car was not an option in Harvey. There were boats, kayaks, and a lot of spontaneous response that actually was really fantastic. And so, the issues of what if the major transportation nodes are taken out and how those evacuations are going to happen, really Harvey was a huge challenge. And it was really interesting because in the Harris County or City of Houston emergency operation plan, police is in charge of evacuations, and fire is in charge of life rescues. Well, fire didn't have boats, so and evacuations were not typically what the Houston Police Department does. Houston Police Department will control evacuation routes along the evacuation routes. So there is a huge confusion about that plan and the annex and who is supposed to be doing what initially. And certainly, the Houston Fire Department was not prepared for such massive watercraft evacuations. And here, the spontaneous volunteers and the citizen response was really critical. I think, Darren, also you mentioned the bond that just passed, the several $million bond for Harris County that is going to take care of the bayous and transportation networks and mitigation practices for the future. So I encourage you all, if you haven't read about it, it's a very interesting read on some of the mitigation strategies post Harvey in the Harris County, City of Houston area. Then you moved your discussion into pets, and you had some really good thoughts about the pets and larger animals, and how pets in disasters are going to be a critical element, whether people evacuate or not, whether the shelters have pet options or not, and RG did. And so I'll tell you, this is so traumatic for me, because when NRG closed, that was the mass sheltering facility that was open spontaneously, that wasn't planned, but it was open spontaneously in Harvey because Red Cross shelter plan collapsed initially. Energy allowed pets. Then, as time elapsed and shelters started to close, small churches and things like that, NRG closed, the people that had to go to the next shelter, which was in Greenspoint Mall, or one of them, that was run by Red Cross, and it didn't allow animals, or at least they created the area for animals because they knew at that point they were in a really big pickle because NRG allowed them. So they created a certain area, but it was still chain linked and separated. And those pets were not getting to Greenspoint Mall. They got lost somewhere. It took hours to track them and get them. And it was so much anguish by the residents in the shelter. They got to the shelter and they were waiting for the pets. And then they were separated from those pets to where they were allowed to walk them. But it was a very complicated process. They couldn't feed them. There was somebody else to feed them. There were some that had emotional support animals that were not with them. So huge magnifying of stress and trauma on people in the shelter. Now, mind you, that was September. That was weeks after Harvey hit. So those people have gone through shelter after shelter. Some of them had 4 bracelets on their hands. And now it's this additional factor of pets. So really big issue in disaster. And I think we could do better on pet care planning. Walker County, after Ike, realized that we needed after Rita and Katrina, forgive me, they knew that they needed a better plan. So they created a fostering services plan to where families can actually come to the shelter but doesn't allow pets and foster that pet, feed it, walk it, take care of it, have it in a family, have it in a home, and then return to the owner. That helps. That decreases the anxiety. That helps, with that traumatic stress of the event. Okay, talked about, so allergies and shelters and stuff like that. Some shelters won't, like Red Cross won't allow pets. One of the victims of Harvey, out of the 36 people that died in Harvey, one was evacuated by spontaneous volunteers. She later returned for her pet and she perished. So people care about the pets. People will make emotional decisions based on their pets. It's really important. Emotional support animals, critically vital. If you need an emotional support animal in your day-to-day, you certainly need one when a disaster like that strikes, because those people are a lot more vulnerable. And of course, what strategies can you use? Have a pet care plan, have a medicine, the vet, or a list of vets in the area, a list of emergency clinics where you can go when yours is not accessible because you're displaced. That should certainly help those collapsible carriers and, getting them habituated to those as well. Markings, I think you talked about livestock markings for displaced animals as well, being in touch with vets and zoos and aquariums, reaching out to state and local officials. What could affect the wildlife? You talked about gators, there are a lot of snakes and rats and all kind of animals, and particularly in flooding waters. And resulting rabies and angry animals and animals that are scared, so they are becoming ultimately aggressive. There were cases in Katrina where police officers who were responding from different parts of the country had to shoot the dogs that were for weeks, going and wandering the areas, and they were both then sick and very aggressive, and they were a threat. So, really psychological issues, for emergency responders when they have to do that as well, are huge. And of course, some of the wildlife will take care of itself. And as you mentioned, the rats and snakes going to the higher areas. There's a really interesting case during Ike in Galveston. There was a lion that was locked up in a church with a big sign on the church door, "Please do not open it." So, there are going to be some issues with animal transport and from some, entertainment centers, zoos, or some other outfits of people having exotic animals that can get lost. So that's certainly an issue. In Harvey, something really interesting, there were the flotillas of fire ants. And the fire ants created huge lily pads. And fire ants are fascinating because, one layer of fire ants is going to dive underwater and then they gonna hold their breath supporting the other part of the colony, and then they switch, and those are huge threats, especially to people. I'm allergic to fire ant bites, so I was particularly very vigilant about fire ants in Harvey, and there were huge flotillas of them identified. I think that's all I have. I don't know what you discussed really on subcultures. I had one really good example for you from University of Texas in Brownsville. I did some research there and some training with the local emergency management for that university, and professors and local police and university police. And it was a few years back, and they discussed, they all talked about how things were before the war versus then. And when I was there, actually, there was shooting happening across the border. And there was bullet holes that afternoon in one of the buildings. The University of Texas Brownsville is right on the border, and it's right across. You had an activity, so to speak. So they talked about what they used to do before the war versus during the war. So before the war, people were going to lunch to Matamoros. The border crossing was easy peasy, 5 minutes, you knew were there, and and it was just a really vibrant passing and a really good community. After the war, so 2008, the cartels increased activity in the area. People in Matamoros locked their doors. A lot of them left town. I mean, the city got, it's a ghost town. The people that were wealthy enough and could leave left. There are drones over the university all the time. When the federales are in conflict with the drug dealers and stuff like that. And so the professors were saying, before the war, I used to go to Big Bend National Park all the time. Now I don't go because there are checkpoints and it's a hassle, and the border patrol is on the roads, and so they had their language and their little adaptations to that particular crisis, which is a slow, a different type of crisis, as shown on classification by Quarantelli. But what was interesting, why I bring it up about that subculture, is because as they were planning the University of Texas system has an evacuation plan for the coastal disaster. And the disaster happens in the south. The buses have to go towards Austin. So they're going to be the reception area for evacuees is going to be in Austin for those other universities. And the big concern of the faculty and emergency planners and police was that they had a lot of undocumented students. And so the checkpoints that would happen along the routes to Austin would be jeopardizing, if you wanted to evacuate people that were undocumented. And one area of evacuations in disasters that I think is totally unexplored, or very little explored, is the issue of illegal immigrants or undocumented residents who already are a vulnerable population because they do not want to contact public officials, or certainly not your traditional law enforcement entities, because they are already super cautious about where they go and how they go and what places they frequent. Disasters really accentuate those groups being tremendously isolated. And so it begs the question is, do we have changing policies for interaction with those groups in disasters by law enforcement, by public officials? And the question is, would that federal law enforcement officer from ICE or Border Patrol stopping that bus that goes to Austin from Brownsville, would they adopt the watchman policing style, or would they follow policy on, whatever they felt that they needed to do in a more legalistic style? And I think it's another interesting area of research is what happens in disasters to how isolated and marginalized the illegal residents in this country are, because they tend to already hide, because their fears are a lot higher. Their social influence is very low. They don't have those networks. They don't belong to big social capital. And so they will tend to be sort of in the shadows. So, you know, that's something to think about as you are thinking about, you know, those factors, who evacuates and who is going to suffer the most. I know that in my community, the one family that I know is undocumented, lived through Harvey in a flooded home, moved to the upper floors, and stayed in that home, did not leave at home, and they were not, you know, they were not present at any, you know, FEMA reimbursement meetings and stuff like that, because, you know, they wouldn't qualify for that. So the entire family lived in a contaminated home. You know, the community helps to the extent that the community helps, but you know, as far as formal resources and the ability to access them, it's very limited. So, you know, that's a good topic for reflection for all of you. So I wanted to thank you for a really nice discussion and good work on your group. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll see you on the next one.